The December morning light filtered through the garage windows in slanted bars, illuminating dust motes that danced over the neat rows of storage boxes. Each one was labeled in my late wife Margaret's careful script. Christmas 1987. Ornaments fragile. Ethan's baby's first Christmas. 23 years of accumulated holiday memories stacked against the far wall like a timeline I could walk through with my fingertips. I pulled down the box marked Lights Tested Good 2019 and set it on my workbench. The same workbench where I'd wrapped presents every Christmas Eve for 34 years, where Margaret would sit on the old metal stool, sorting ribbon while I fumbled with scissors that never seemed sharp enough. The stool was still there, though no one had sat on it for 3 years now. My hands moved automatically, checking each strand of lights the way I always had. Plug in, test, replace the dead bulbs, win them back up. Margaret used to say I was more methodical about Christmas decorations than I'd ever been about anything else in my life. She wasn't wrong. There was something about the ritual that steadied me, especially now that the house echoed with only my footsteps. The garage smelled of motor oil and wood shavings, with an undertone of something sweeter. The ghost of Christmas cookies that Margaret had baked in batches so large we'd give half away to neighbors. She'd store the tins out here when the kitchen counter ran out of space, and even now, opening certain boxes brought back that scent of vanilla and cinnamon. I was testing the third strand when I heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Through the garage window, I could see Ethan's silver BMW pulling up beside my old Ford pickup. The contrast always made me smile, though not in a pleasant way. His car was pristine, detailed weekly, while mine bore the honest scars of 40 years hauling lumber and mulch. Ethan stepped out first, his breath visible in the cold air. At 35, he'd grown into the kind of man who looked successful from a distance. Pressed slacks, wool coat, hair styled with something that cost more than I'd ever spent on a haircut. But there was something in his posture, a restlessness that reminded me of a salesman who couldn't quite close the deal. Madison emerged from the passenger side, her heels clicking against the concrete as she picked her way around the small puddles left by yesterday's rain. She was beautiful in that polished way that suggested effort, every detail carefully considered. Her smile was bright and practiced as she waved at me through the window. "Dad!" Ethan called out, his voice carrying that forced cheer I'd grown accustomed to. "We're here for the Christmas haul." I set down the string of lights and walked to the side door, wiping my hands on the rag I kept in my back pocket. "Morning," I said, stepping aside to let them into the garage. "You're early." "The early bird catches the worm," Madison said, her eyes already scanning the labeled boxes. "We wanted to get here before the roads got too busy." It was a Saturday in early December, hardly peak traffic time, but I didn't correct her. Instead, I watched as Ethan moved toward the Christmas boxes with the kind of purposeful stride I recognized from his childhood. The walk of a boy who knew where the good stuff was hidden. "Looks like you've got everything organized," he said, lifting the corner of a box labeled Outdoor Decorations. "Same system as always." "Your mother's system," I corrected gently. "I just maintain it." Madison was examining a box of ornaments, her manicured fingers trailing over Margaret's handwriting. "These are so sweet," she said. "All the little family memories." But her tone suggested she was cataloging rather than appreciating. We spent the next hour going through the boxes. Ethan and Madison worked with an efficiency that felt almost professional, lifting out decorations and sorting them into 2 piles, what they'd take to their house and what could stay. I found myself relegated to the role of curator, answering questions about which lights were brightest, which ornaments were most durable. "This tree topper is gorgeous," Madison said, holding up the ceramic angel Margaret had bought during our honeymoon in Vermont. "The detail work is incredible." "Margaret found that at a little shop in Stowe," I said. "She said it looked like the angel was actually listening to something important." Madison nodded absently, then placed the angel in their take pile. "It'll look perfect on our 12-footer. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. The angel had crowned our Christmas tree for 32 years. It was the first thing Margaret would place each December, standing on her tiptoes while I held the ladder steady. But I said nothing. Ethan was examining a box of vintage ornaments, the ones Margaret had inherited from her grandmother. Hand-blown glass in deep reds and blues, each one wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Some were fragile enough that we'd only hung them on the higher branches, away from curious children's hands when Ethan was small. "These are probably worth something," he said, holding one up to catch the light. "Real craftsmanship." "They're family heirlooms," I said quietly. "Exactly," Madison chimed in. "That's why we should take care of them. Our house has better climate control." Again I said nothing, but I watched as ornament after ornament disappeared into their boxes, including the small wooden train that Margaret had bought the Christmas we learned she was pregnant. Ethan had played with that train every December until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. Now it was just inventory to be redistributed. The selection process continued with a casual ruthlessness that shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow did. The good lights, the ones with steady bulbs and thick cords, went to their house. The artificial garland Margaret had splurged on during our better financial years went to their house. Even the outdoor wreaths, the ones I'd hung on my own front door every December since we'd moved here, were deemed better suited for their colonial's proportions. "What about these?" Madison asked, pointing to a small box labeled Special Ornaments, M's Favorites. I opened it for her, revealing Margaret's most treasured pieces, a small glass bird that had belonged to her mother, a wooden star I'd carved for her during our second Christmas together, a tiny silver bell that chimed softly when you shook it, the one she'd bought at a church bazaar because she said it sounded like joy. Madison's eyes lit up. "Oh, these are lovely, very vintage chic." "They were your mother's most precious ornaments," I told Ethan. "She had stories for everyone." He picked up the wooden star, turning it over in his hands. "I remember this one. You made it in the garage." "Took me 3 tries to get the points even," I said. "Your mother hung it in the same spot every year." Ethan nodded, then placed it in their pile. "We'll take good care of it." The silver bell went next, then the glass bird. One by one, Margaret's favorites disappeared into their collection. I stood there watching, feeling like a man whose house was being emptied by very polite burglars. By the time they finished, their pile was considerable. 2 large boxes of ornaments, 3 sets of lights, all the outdoor decorations, the good artificial tree from our bedroom, and enough miscellaneous Christmas items to stock a small store. My pile consisted of a few strings of older lights, some faded tinsel, and a collection of homemade ornaments that Ethan had crafted in elementary school, construction paper angels and popsicle stick stars that weren't quite valuable enough to merit their attention. "This should be perfect," Madison said, surveying their haul. "We're hosting Christmas Eve this year for my family, and we want everything to look just right." "Christmas Eve?" I asked. It was the first I'd heard of it. Ethan had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "We've been meaning to talk to you about that," he said. "Madison's parents are flying in from Phoenix, and her sister's bringing the kids. We thought it would be nice to have everyone at our place." "It's just so much more convenient," Madison added. "More space, better kitchen for cooking. And honestly, Dad, you shouldn't have to worry about hosting at your age." At my age? I was 71, not 90. I still climbed ladders to clean gutters and split my own firewood. But apparently, in their calculation, I'd crossed some invisible line into decrepitude. "What about Christmas morning?" I asked, another exchanged glance between them. "Well," Ethan said slowly, "we were thinking we'd have our own little celebration. You know, just the immediate family." "Am I not immediate family?" "Of course you are," Madison said quickly. "It's just that with the kids and all the excitement, it might be a bit much. We could do something quiet with you later in the week." Later in the week, after the real Christmas had happened, after the children had opened their presents and the family photos had been taken, I would get the leftovers of the holiday, the scraps of their time when nothing better was on the calendar. I helped them load their cars, carrying box after box to the BMW and Madison's white SUV. The garage looked sparse when we finished, like a store after a clearance sale. The remaining decorations sat in their corners looking abandoned, the Christmas leftovers that nobody wanted. "Thanks for this, Dad," Ethan said, brushing dust off his coat. "The house is going to look amazing." "Margaret would have liked that," I said. He nodded, but he was already distracted, checking his watch. "We should get going. We promised Madison's mom we'd call this afternoon." They left with warm hugs and promises to talk soon about the holidays. I stood in the driveway until their cars disappeared around the corner, then walked back into the garage. The silence felt different now, heavier. I picked up one of the homemade ornaments Ethan had left behind, a lopsided angel made from a paper plate and cotton balls. Margaret had treasured it as much as any store-bought decoration, hanging it prominently on the tree every year and telling anyone who'd listen about her artistic son. Now, it sat forgotten in a box marked "Keep Dad's House." That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee, looking at the corner where our Christmas tree had stood for 34 years. The space looked naked without it, just an empty patch of carpet and a wall outlet that had been hidden for so many Decembers, I'd forgotten it existed. I thought about Margaret's excitement this time of year, how she'd start planning Christmas dinner in October and begin her shopping by Thanksgiving. She'd make lists on the backs of envelopes, crossing off names as she found the perfect gift for each person. The house would smell like pine and cinnamon, and she'd play the same Christmas albums on repeat until I knew every word by heart. Now the house smelled like coffee and the lingering traces of motor oil from my afternoon in the garage. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional creak of the house settling around me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken last Christmas. There was Margaret in her red sweater, laughing at something Ethan had said. There was the tree, heavy with ornaments, including all the ones that were now decorating someone else's house. There was Ethan, arms full of presents, grinning like a boy instead of a man approaching middle age. That had been Margaret's last Christmas. By February, the cancer had taken her voice. By April, it had taken everything else. I closed the phone and sat back in my chair. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor was testing their Christmas lights. The blinking colored glow filtered through my curtains in cheerful patterns that felt like mockery. That Christmas morning, I realized every gift under the tree had been taken for themselves. My son didn't even look back at me. But what bothered me more than the ornaments or the lights or even the casual dismissal of my holiday plans was the feeling that I was being managed, handled like an aging relative who needed to be placated and contained, whose wants and needs were secondary to the real family's convenience. Margaret would have been furious. She'd have found words I couldn't, delivered with the kind of steel-wrapped in velvet tone that could make a grown man reconsider his choices. But Margaret wasn't here to defend the traditions we'd built together, to insist that Christmas morning meant family gathered around one tree, not scattered across multiple houses based on who had the better kitchen. I was on my own now, sitting in a house that felt too large and too quiet, surrounded by the remnants of a Christmas collection that had been picked over like a yard sale. And for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I felt something sharper than grief settling in my chest. I felt anger. The days that followed blurred together in a routine I'd never intended to establish. Coffee at 6, reading the paper until 7, then finding projects around the house to fill the hours until evening came, and I could justify pouring myself 2 fingers of bourbon, the same brand Margaret and I used to share on winter nights. I'd catch myself setting out 2 mugs sometimes, an old habit that died harder than I'd expected. The extra mug would sit there on the counter, a ceramic reminder that my audience had shrunk to 1. Margaret used to say I was at my most philosophical when I had someone to talk to, that my thoughts needed a witness to become fully formed. Now, they just rattled around in my head like loose change. It was during one of these solitary evenings that I found myself in Margaret's sewing room. I'd avoided it for months after the funeral, but something about the hollow feeling left by Ethan's visit drew me there. The room still smelled faintly of her lavender hand cream, though I knew that was probably my imagination by now. Her quilting supplies sat exactly as she'd left them. Half-finished projects folded neatly in baskets, spools of thread arranged by color in a wooden rack I'd built for her 25th birthday. On the small desk by the window, her reading glasses rested on top of a pattern book, still open to a page about Christmas stockings. I sat in her chair, a wingback she'd reupholstered in soft blue fabric, and opened the top drawer of her desk. Inside, I found what I was looking for without really knowing I'd been looking for it. Her Christmas notebooks. Margaret had kept detailed records of every holiday for 34 years. Not just gift lists, but memories. Who said what at dinner, which recipes worked, which traditions the family embraced or abandoned. Page after page of her careful handwriting, documenting the evolution of our Christmases from young couple to parents to grandparents who never got the chance to spoil grandchildren. I opened the most recent notebook, dated last year. Her handwriting had grown shakier by then, the cancer affecting her fine motor control, but her observations were as sharp as ever. Ethan seemed distracted during dinner, kept checking his phone. Madison made several comments about updating our decorating style. Not sure what that means, but the way she said it made me think she's been thinking about this for a while. I flipped back a few pages and found her notes from Christmas morning. E opened his gifts quickly, almost impatiently. Used to savor the unwrapping when he was small. Madison took photos of everything, but didn't seem to really look at anything. They left earlier than usual, said they had plans with her family. When did we stop being enough? The last entry was dated December 27th. Talked to Richard about next year. Told him if something happens to me, he shouldn't let anyone turn Christmas into something it's not. It's about love, not display. About family, not performance. He promised he'd remember that. Hope he does. I closed the notebook and sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Margaret had seen it coming, the gradual transformation of our son into someone who viewed family traditions as assets to be redistributed. She'd tried to warn me in her gentle way, but I'd been too focused on her illness to pay attention to the smaller betrayals happening around us. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Ethan's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but old habits die hard, and I found myself answering. "Hi, Dad," he said, his voice carrying that practiced cheer again. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't entirely false either. "Good, good. Listen, Madison and I were talking, and we had an idea. Why don't you come stay with us for a few days over Christmas? We've got that guest room that never gets used, and it would be nice to have you close by." The offer sounded generous on the surface, but I heard the undertone. They wanted me contained, supervised, prevented from making my own plans that might interfere with theirs. "I appreciate the thought," I said carefully, "but I'm comfortable here. Dad, come on. You shouldn't be alone on Christmas. It's not healthy." "I won't be alone," I said. "I'll be with your mother." A pause. "Dad, Mom's gone. Her memory isn't?" Another pause, longer this time. "Look, we're just worried about you. That big house, all by yourself. Maybe it's time to think about downsizing." There it was, the real agenda, delivered with practiced casualness. First the Christmas decorations, then the holiday traditions, now the house itself. They were dismantling my life piece by piece, packaging it as concern for my welfare. "This house is fine," I said. "It's a lot of maintenance for one person, and honestly, the property taxes alone are my responsibility," I finished, "as is the maintenance. I'm just saying, there are some nice senior communities around here, places where you'd have people your own age, activities, meal plans. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. Senior communities, places where they put old people to wait quietly for death, where every decision was made by someone else and individual preferences were subsumed into group activities designed to keep everyone docile and manageable." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, which we both knew meant no. After we hung up, I walked through the house room by room, seeing it through their eyes. The kitchen with its 40-year-old appliances that still worked perfectly. The living room with furniture that had been stylish once and was now simply comfortable. The master bedroom where Margaret and I had slept for 3 decades, where her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand because I couldn't bring myself to move them. To Ethan and Madison, this was wasted space. Square footage that could be converted to cash, equity that served no purpose sitting in the hands of an old man who would probably be dead in a decade anyway. They saw maintenance costs and property taxes, where I saw the physical embodiment of a life well lived. But what disturbed me most was the realization that this wasn't sudden. Margaret's notebook entries suggested the erosion had been happening for years, so gradually that I'd failed to notice it. Like watching your hair turn gray. You don't see it happening day by day. But one morning, you look in the mirror and wonder when you became old. The next few days brought a steady stream of what I now recognized as pressure. Madison called to tell me about a lovely retirement community she'd driven past, complete with a golf course and a craft room. Ethan stopped by with printed articles about the dangers of elderly people living alone, statistics about falls and medical emergencies that went unnoticed for days. They were building a case, I realized, creating a paper trail of their concern, their due diligence, their attempts to convince me to make the reasonable choice. If something did happen to me, If I fell down the stairs or had another heart episode, they'd be able to point to all the times they'd suggested alternatives, all the warnings they'd given about the risks of aging in place. It was during one of these visits that I noticed something that chilled me more than their overt pressure tactics. Ethan was taking pictures. Not obvious ones, he was subtle about it. But I caught him photographing the water damage in the basement ceiling, the crack in the front steps, the loose handrail on the back porch. Small maintenance issues that any house develops over time, but which could be presented as evidence of an elderly man's inability to maintain his property. Just documenting some things that might need attention, he said when I asked about it, for when you're ready to make some changes. When, not if. The assumption that my resistance was temporary, that eventually age or infirmity or simple exhaustion would wear down my defenses and I'd gratefully accept their solution to the problem of my independence. That night, I called my lawyer. Harold Brennan had handled Margaret's will and our estate planning for 20 years. He was my age, which meant he understood the particular vulnerabilities of our generation, the ways that well-meaning children could gradually assume control of their parents' lives under the guise of protection. "Richard," he said when I explained the situation, "I've seen this before, more often than I'd like to admit. The key is making sure your wishes are documented clearly and legally before anyone can claim you're not competent to make decisions. What do you recommend?" "Several things. First, a comprehensive financial power of attorney that specifies exactly what powers you're granting and to whom. Second, updated healthcare directives that reflect your current wishes. Third, consideration of a trust structure that protects your assets while allowing you to maintain control during your lifetime. And if they claim I'm not mentally competent, then we make sure there's recent medical documentation of your cognitive function. I can refer you to a geriatrician who specializes in competency evaluations. Clean bill of health on that front makes it much harder for anyone to challenge your decisions." I made appointments for the following week. Legal armor, Harold called it, protection against family members who confused love with control, who couldn't distinguish between helping and taking over. But even as I took these defensive measures, I found myself thinking about Margaret's final notebook entry, her hope that I wouldn't let anyone turn Christmas into something it wasn't, the promise I'd made to remember that it was about love, not display. Somewhere in the process of protecting myself from my son's benevolent manipulation, I needed to find a way to honor that promise, to reclaim not just my independence, but the meaning of the traditions Margaret and I had built together. The irony wasn't lost on me that Christmas, a holiday about family and togetherness, had become the battlefield on which I was fighting for the right to remain myself. But as I sat in Margaret's sewing room, surrounded by her careful records of 3 decades of holiday memories, I began to understand that this fight wasn't really about Christmas decorations or dinner invitations or where I chose to live. It was about the difference between being loved and being managed, between being family and being a problem to be solved. And for the first time since Margaret's death, I felt ready to make that distinction clear. The appointment with Dr. Sarah Coleman went better than I'd expected. Harold had recommended her as someone who specialized in geriatric assessments, and her office felt more like a living room than a medical facility. She was younger than I'd anticipated, maybe 50, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd heard every excuse and deflection in the book. "Your lawyer tells me you're concerned about your family questioning your mental capacity," she said, settling into a chair across from me with a thick folder. "My son thinks I'm not capable of making decisions about my own life," I said. "I'd like medical documentation that says otherwise." She spent 2 hours putting me through cognitive tests, memory exercises, and problem-solving scenarios. When we finished, she leaned back and smiled. "Mr. Davidson, your cognitive function is excellent for someone your age. Better than excellent, actually. You scored in the 95th percentile across all measures. If your son is questioning your mental capacity, it's not based on any medical reality. Can you put that in writing?" "Absolutely. And I'd recommend annual follow-ups to maintain a current record. It's unfortunate that families sometimes confuse normal aging with incompetence, but having clear documentation protects everyone involved." I left her office with a sealed envelope containing my evaluation and a renewed sense of confidence. Whatever Ethan and Madison were planning, they'd have to find a different angle of attack. The legal appointments took longer. Harold walked me through documents I'd never thought I'd need. detailed power of attorney forms that specified exactly what decisions I was and wasn't delegating, healthcare directives that left no room for interpretation, and a trust structure that would protect my assets while allowing me to maintain complete control during my lifetime. The beauty of this setup, Harold explained, is that it makes it nearly impossible for anyone to claim you haven't planned properly for your future. You're not a stubborn old man refusing to face reality. You're a prudent individual who's made careful arrangements for every contingency. And the house? Protected. The trust owns it, but you control the trust. Even if someone were to challenge your competency successfully, which they won't, given Dr. Coleman's evaluation, the trust structure remains intact. I signed papers until my hand cramped, each signature a small declaration of independence. When we finished, Harold walked me to the door. "Richard," he said, "I hope you never need any of these protections, but if you do, you're ready." The week before Christmas, Ethan and Madison increased their pressure. They stopped by, unannounced, always with some new concern about my welfare. The furnace made a funny noise. Shouldn't I have that checked? The driveway was icy. What if I fell? The neighbors mentioned they hadn't seen me in a few days. Was I eating properly? Each visit felt like an inspection, their eyes cataloging potential problems, their phones ready to document any sign of decline. They were building their case methodically, creating a narrative of an elderly man whose judgment was compromised by grief and isolation. But they made a mistake during their visit on December 22nd. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Madison on the phone in the living room, her voice low but carrying in the quiet house. "I know it seems harsh," she was saying, "but honestly, he can't keep living like this. The house is falling apart, and he's in complete denial about his limitations. We found mold in the basement, loose railings, electrical issues. It's not safe." Mold in the basement, electrical issues, problems that didn't exist, or at least had been dramatically exaggerated. They weren't just documenting real concerns, they were manufacturing evidence. I stayed in the kitchen, listening as she continued. "The Christmas thing was the last straw. He's so fixated on the past that he can't see what's practical. We're trying to help him, but he's fighting us every step of the way. Maybe after the holidays, we'll need to take more direct action. Direct action, legal intervention, most likely. A competency hearing based on their manufactured evidence of my decline and their documented attempts to help me see reason." When they left that afternoon, I called Harold. "They're accelerating their timeline," I told him, "and they're not above creating evidence to support their case." "Then we accelerate ours," he said. "I'm going to have a colleague document the actual condition of your house. Professional inspection, photographs, the works. If they want to claim it's unsafe, they'll have to explain why a licensed contractor disagrees." The inspector came the next morning, a no-nonsense woman named Janet, who'd been assessing properties for 30 years. She spent 4 hours going through every room, every system, every potential problem area. "Minor issues," she said when she finished. "Nothing that poses any safety risk, and certainly nothing that suggests neglect. Whoever told you this house was unsafe was either misinformed or had other motives." Christmas Eve arrived gray and cold, with the kind of sharp wind that cut through your coat, and reminded you that winter wasn't just a season, but a state of being. I spent the morning in the garage, not organizing or cleaning, but simply standing among the remnants of my Christmas collection, trying to summon some vestige of holiday spirit. The phone rang at noon. Ethan, of course. "Dad, change of plans," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Madison's parents had to cancel their flight, weather delays, so we're free tonight after all." "I see. We were thinking we could come over there, have Christmas Eve at your place, like old times." Like old times, as if the past month of pressure and manipulation could be erased with a phone call and some forced nostalgia. "What about your 12-foot tree?" I asked. "All those decorations you took?" A pause. "We thought it would be nice to celebrate where Mom spent her last Christmas." The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. They'd stripped my house of its Christmas spirit, then expected me to be grateful for their presence when their better option fell through. "I don't think so," I said quietly. "Dad, come on, it's Christmas Eve." "Yes, it is, and I'm spending it the way I choose." "You can't just sit there alone on Christmas Eve. That's not what Mom would have wanted." "Don't tell me what your mother would have wanted," I said, my voice harder than I'd intended. She left me her thoughts on that subject, in writing. Another pause, longer this time. What do you mean? I mean your mother kept detailed records of every Christmas, including her concerns about how you and Madison were treating our family traditions. Would you like me to read you some of her observations? Silence. Then, Dad, if you're going to be unreasonable, I'm being protective, I interrupted, of my home, my choices, and my wife's memory, things you seem to have forgotten how to value. I hung up before he could respond, then unplugged the phone from the wall. The silence that followed felt like benediction. That evening, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals. I poured a glass of bourbon, her favorite brand, and toasted the empty chair where she used to sit. "Merry Christmas, Margaret," I said aloud. I kept my promise. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the world in the kind of pristine white that made everything look new again. I sat by the living room window, watching the flakes dance and the streetlights glow, and for the first time in months, I felt peaceful. The phone stayed unplugged, the house stayed quiet, and somewhere in that silence, I began to plan. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made you believe in possibilities. I made coffee and sat in my chair, looking at the corner where our tree had stood for 34 years. The space was empty, but it didn't feel vacant anymore. It felt expectant, like a stage waiting for the right performance. I walked to Margaret's desk and pulled out a fresh notebook, the kind she'd used for her Christmas records. On the first page, I wrote, "Plans for reclaiming Christmas." Underneath, I began to list ideas. Some were simple. Buy new decorations, create new traditions, find ways to honor Margaret's memory without being held hostage by other people's expectations. Others were more complex, legal strategies, property protections, ways to ensure that my choices remained mine regardless of what my family thought was best for me. But as I wrote, I realized that this wasn't just about Christmas. It was about the fundamental question of who gets to decide how you live your life when the people who claim to love you think they know better than you do. Margaret's notebook entries had shown me that Ethan's transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, almost imperceptible, like erosion wearing away at stone. But erosion could be stopped if you recognized it early enough and took steps to reinforce your foundation. I had reinforced mine. Legal documents, medical evaluations, property inspections, all the armor Harold had recommended. But armor was defensive. What I needed now was an offensive strategy, a way to reclaim not just my independence, but my dignity. The answer came to me as I sat there writing, the winter sunlight streaming through the window and warming my hands. It was so simple, I almost laughed. I was going to give them exactly what they claimed to want. A father who planned responsibly for his future, who made careful decisions about his property and his legacy. But I was going to do it on my terms, in ways they never expected. By the time I finished writing, I had a plan that would protect everything Margaret and I had built together, while teaching my son a lesson about the difference between love and control. The war for my independence was about to begin, and this time I held all the weapons. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a strange calm, like the stillness before a storm. I spent my days organizing, not Christmas decorations this time, but documents, financial records, property deeds, insurance policies, all the paper trail of a life lived carefully and responsibly. Harold had been right about the importance of documentation, but I was taking it several steps further. I photographed every room in the house, methodically documenting its condition, not because I believed Ethan and Madison's claims about deterioration, but because I wanted an unassailable record of reality. The basement they claimed was moldy, was dry, and well-maintained. The electrical system they had called dangerous had been updated just 5 years ago. The house they portrayed as a burden was actually a well-preserved piece of craftsmanship that had appreciated considerably since Margaret and I had bought it 32 years ago. On December 28th, I drove to the bank and met with my financial advisor, a patient woman named Carol who'd helped Margaret and me plan for retirement. She spread my portfolio across her desk like a general studying battle maps. "Your position is quite strong, Mr. Davidson," she said. "The house is paid off, your investments are well diversified, and your expenses are modest. You could maintain your current lifestyle indefinitely, or afford any level of care you might need in the future." What about if I wanted to make changes to my estate planning? What kind of changes? I pulled out a list I'd prepared. Charitable donations, specific bequests, perhaps establishing some educational scholarships in my wife's name. Carol's eyebrows lifted slightly. Those are all excellent options. How much were you thinking of allocating? Most of it, I said. I want to leave something meaningful for my son, but not enough to make him wealthy for doing nothing. She studied my list more carefully. This is quite a departure from your current will. Are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We spent 2 hours going through options. Educational scholarships at the local college where Margaret had volunteered. Donations to the Veterans Organization where I'd served on the board for 10 years. A substantial gift to the animal shelter where we'd adopted 3 dogs over the decades. Each allocation felt like a small victory, a way of ensuring that our money would do good in the world rather than simply enabling my son's sense of entitlement. I'll have the revised documents ready by next week, Carol said as we finished. But Mr. Davidson, I have to ask, is your son aware of these changes? Not yet, I said, but he will be. That evening, I called my neighbor, Tom Martinez. Tom was a year younger than me, a retired firefighter with the kind of practical skills that came from decades of solving other people's emergencies. We'd become friends after Margaret's death, bonding over the shared experience of sudden widowerhood and the challenge of learning to live alone after 40 years of marriage. Richard, he said when he answered, how was your Christmas? Educational, I said. Tom, I need a favor. Would you be willing to be an emergency contact for me? Someone who checks in regularly, has a key to the house? Of course. Everything all right? Just taking some precautions, making sure I have support systems in place that aren't tied to family. Tom was quiet for a moment. Your son giving you trouble? Let's just say he has strong opinions about how I should live my life. Ah, well, you can count on me. Want me to come by tomorrow? We could set up some kind of regular schedule. That would be perfect. The next morning, Tom appeared at my door with a toolbox and a thermos of coffee. We spent the morning installing new deadbolts on all the exterior doors, updating the security system, and programming each other's numbers into our phones as emergency contacts. Simple precautions, but ones that would make it much harder for anyone to claim I was isolated or unsafe. You know, Tom said as we tested the new locks, my daughter tried the same thing with me last year. Kept insisting I needed to move into one of those assisted living places. Finally had to sit her down and explain that I wasn't ready to be managed like a child. What did you say to her? Told her that love means trusting people to make their own decisions, even when you don't agree with them. Control means making decisions for people because you think you know better than they do. Asked her which one she thought she was showing me. Did it work? Took a while, but yeah, she backed off. Sometimes adult children need to be reminded that their parents are still adults. That afternoon, I drove to the local college and met with the development officer, an energetic young woman named Jessica, who seemed genuinely excited about the scholarship program I was proposing. Margaret had tutored students there for 15 years, helping adults returning to school after military service or career changes. The Margaret Davidson Adult Learner Scholarship, Jessica said, testing the name. I love it. How much were you thinking of endowing? I named a figure that made her eyes widen. Mr. Davidson, that's incredibly generous. This could help dozens of students over the years. That's the idea. My wife believed everyone deserved a second chance at education. I'd like to make sure that belief outlives both of us. On New Year's Eve, I sat in Margaret's sewing room with her Christmas notebook spread across the desk. I'd been reading through years of entries, tracing the evolution of our family through her careful observations. What struck me wasn't just how perceptive she'd been about Ethan's gradual change, but how much joy she'd found in the small details of our celebrations. Richard spent 3 hours hanging lights on the outside of the house today. I told him no one would see them from the road, but he said he'd know they were there. That's my husband. He does things right whether anyone notices or not. Ethan helped me make cookies this afternoon. He's still young enough to lick the bowl without being embarrassed. I hope he never loses that. Found Richard in the garage this morning, wrapping presents and talking to himself. When I asked what he was saying, he told me he was practicing his surprised face for when I opened the gift he made me. 43 years old, and he still wants to surprise his wife. I'm the luckiest woman alive. Her words painted a picture of a marriage built on small kindnesses and shared traditions, on the understanding that love was something you demonstrated daily rather than declared occasionally. Reading her observations of our life together, I felt a profound gratitude for the woman who'd seen beauty in ordinary moments and recorded them for posterity. But I also felt a growing anger at what Ethan and Madison were trying to take away. Not just my independence or my property, but the very essence of what Margaret and I had built together. They saw our traditions as quaint artifacts to be updated or discarded, our home as an asset to be optimized, our love story as something that had ended when she died, rather than something that continued in every choice I made to honor her memory. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a month earlier. I was going to fight back, not just defensively, but offensively. I was going to show my son exactly what it meant to be managed by someone who thought they knew what was best for you. The war for my independence was about to become a war for my dignity, and I intended to win both. On New Year's Day, I started making calls to Harold, to Carol, to the development office at the college. Each conversation was a small step in a larger plan, a carefully orchestrated campaign to reclaim control of my own life while teaching Ethan and Madison a lesson they'd never forget. By the time I finished, I had appointments scheduled for the entire first week of January. Legal documents to finalize, financial transfers to execute, property decisions to implement. Everything would be done properly, legally, with full documentation of my mental competence and careful consideration of all options. When Ethan and Madison finally learned what I'd done, they'd discover that managing someone else's life was much easier when that person wasn't fighting back, and by then, it would be too late for them to do anything about it. The old year had taken my wife, my Christmas traditions, and my illusions about my son's character, but the new year was going to be mine. I raised a glass of Margaret's favorite bourbon to her photograph on the mantel. "Here's to new beginnings," I said aloud, "and to finishing what we started." Outside, fireworks lit up the sky, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang in the year that would change everything. The first week of January brought a cold snap that made the house creak and settle like old bones. I'd always loved this time of year, the quiet after the holidays, the sense of starting fresh, the way winter stripped everything down to its essentials. This year, that feeling of essential truth felt particularly relevant. Harold's office was warm and smelled of leather and old coffee. He'd assembled a small army of documents on his conference table, each one representing a different aspect of the plan we'd been developing. I sat across from him, reading through papers that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my family's future. "Are you certain about this, Richard?" he asked for the third time. "Once these documents are executed, there's no going back." "I've never been more certain of anything," I said, signing my name with the careful precision Margaret had always admired. "Except maybe marrying my wife." The scholarship endowment went through first. $500,000 to establish the Margaret Davidson Adult Learner Scholarship in perpetuity. Jessica at the college had nearly cried when I'd called to confirm the amount. "Mr. Davidson, this will change lives for generations," she'd said. "Your wife's legacy will live on through every student this helps." Next came the charitable donations. The Veterans Organization received enough to fund their entire housing assistance program for 3 years. The animal shelter got a new building fund. The local food bank received an endowment that would provide meals for hungry families long after I was gone. Each gift felt like a small piece of justice, money flowing to places where it would actually help people rather than simply enabling more consumption. "The house is next," Harold said, sliding another set of documents across the table. "Are you sure about this arrangement?" I picked up the deed transfer papers. Instead of leaving the house to Ethan in my will, I was placing it in a conservation trust that would preserve it as a historical property. The trust would allow me to live there for the rest of my life, but after my death, the house would become a museum showcasing mid-century American domestic life. Margaret would have loved the irony, our home becoming a monument to the kind of family values that Ethan and Madison seemed to have forgotten. "The trust will maintain the property exactly as it is," Harold explained. "Every room, every piece of furniture, every photograph will be preserved. Future visitors will see how a real American family lived in the latter half of the 20th century, including Margaret's sewing room, especially Margaret's sewing room. Her Christmas notebooks, her quilting supplies, her patterns, everything will be preserved as an example of domestic craftsmanship from that era. I signed the papers with a flourish. Perfect. The final document was the most significant, a revised will that left Ethan exactly what he deserved. I'd calculated it carefully, enough to be meaningful, but not enough to fund the lifestyle he and Madison had grown accustomed to. $50,000, with a note explaining that the rest of my estate had been distributed to organizations that would use it to help others rather than simply accumulate more possessions. "He's going to be furious," Harold warned. "He's going to learn the difference between inheritance and entitlement," I corrected. "Margaret and I worked for 40 years to build our estate. The idea that it should automatically transfer to someone who sees us as a burden to be managed is absurd." Harold gathered the documents into a neat stack. "Everything will be filed this afternoon. The charitable transfers will begin processing immediately. By the end of the week, your estate will look very different than it did last month." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd given away most of my money, though there was satisfaction in knowing it would do good in the world, but because I'd reclaimed control of my own narrative. For too long, I'd been a passive character in my son's plans for my future. Now, I was writing my own ending. The call came that evening, just as I was settling down with one of Margaret's mystery novels. Ethan's name on the caller ID, and I could hear the tension in his voice before he even spoke. "Dad, we need to talk." "About what?" "About the rumor Madison heard at the country club. Something about you making large charitable donations." I smiled. News traveled fast in small communities, especially when it involved substantial amounts of money. "Not rumors," I said. "Facts. I've been doing some estate planning." "Without consulting us?" "I'm 71 years old, Ethan. I don't need to consult anyone about my own financial decisions." A pause. "Dad, if you're trying to make some kind of point..." "I'm not trying to make a point. I'm living my life according to my values. Something you might want to consider." "We're coming over," he said. "We need to discuss this face to face." "No," I said calmly. "You're not." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I don't want you in my house right now. Not until you're ready to treat me like a person instead of a problem to be solved." "Dad, you're being unreasonable." "I'm being protective," I interrupted, "of my home, my peace of mind, and my right to make my own decisions. When you're ready to respect those things, we can talk." I hung up and immediately called Tom Martinez. "Tom, I may have some visitors tonight who aren't welcome. Would you mind keeping an eye out?" "Say no more," he said. "I'll keep watch. Anyone gives you trouble, I'll call the police." Sure enough, at 8 o'clock, I heard cars in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see Ethan's BMW and Madison's SUV, along with a third car I didn't recognize. They'd brought reinforcements, probably Madison's parents, who'd flown in from Phoenix after all. The knock came firm and insistent. I didn't answer. The knock came again, followed by Ethan's voice calling through the door. "Dad, we know you're in there. Open up. We need to talk about what you've done." I sat in my chair, reading Margaret's novel and sipping bourbon. The knocking continued for several minutes before giving way to the sound of voices on the porch. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the frustration, the anger, the disbelief that I wasn't cooperating with their intervention. My phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. I turned it off. After half an hour, they gave up and left. I watched their taillights disappear down the street, then called Tom to let him know the coast was clear. "They looked pretty upset," he said. "Everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," I said, for the first time in months. The next morning brought a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal demand that I undergo a mental competency evaluation, signed by Ethan and Madison, claiming they had concerns about my recent erratic behavior and questionable financial decisions. I called Harold immediately. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said after I read him the letter. "But we're ready for this. Dr. Coleman's evaluation, the property inspection, the financial advisor's assessment. We have everything we need to demonstrate that you're not only competent, but exceptionally well prepared for your future." "What do I do about this?" "Ignore it. They have no legal standing to force a competency evaluation unless they can demonstrate immediate danger to yourself or others. Making charitable donations and managing your own estate doesn't qualify. And if they try to escalate, Then we bury them in documentation of your mental acuity and their pattern of attempting to control your decisions. Richard, you've done everything right. They're the ones who are going to look unreasonable in court. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret's death. I went Christmas shopping, not for Christmas past, but for Christmas future. I drove to 3 different stores, buying new decorations, new lights, new ornaments. Everything was post-holiday clearance, which Margaret would have appreciated. She'd always loved a good bargain. I bought a new tree topper, a simple star that reminded me of the one I'd carved for her decades ago. I bought new stockings to hang on the mantel, including one with Margaret's name embroidered in gold thread. I bought candles that smelled like pine and cinnamon, artificial garland that would never fade, and enough lights to outline every window in the house. When I got home, I spent the evening setting up a small display in the living room. Not a full Christmas celebration, it was January after all, but a preview of coming attractions, a promise to myself that next Christmas would be different, would be mine. Tom stopped by as I was stringing lights around the window. "Starting a little early this year?" he asked with a grin. "Planning ahead," I said. "Next Christmas is going to be special." "Good for you. You know, my wife used to say that Christmas wasn't about the decorations or the gifts. It was about choosing joy even when the world seemed dark." "Your wife was a wise woman." "She was. And she'd have liked your Margaret. They had that same strength, you know? The kind of woman who could make a house feel like home just by believing it was one." That night, I sat in my chair surrounded by the soft glow of Christmas lights in January, reading Margaret's notebook entries about the Christmases we'd shared. But instead of sadness, I felt anticipation. Next year, I would create new traditions, new memories, new reasons to celebrate, and I would do it all without anyone's permission but my own. The war for my independence was nearly over. Soon Ethan and Madison would learn that some battles can't be won through manipulation or legal threats. They could only be won by people who refused to surrender their right to live their own lives. I raised my glass to Margaret's photograph, now illuminated by the warm glow of Christmas lights. "Next Christmas will be ours again," I promised her, "just like you always wanted it to be." Outside, snow began to fall, covering the world in the promise of new seasons to come. The confrontation I'd been expecting came on a gray Tuesday morning in mid-January. I was in the kitchen making my second cup of coffee when I heard multiple car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the window, I could see Ethan's BMW, Madison's SUV, and a white sedan I didn't recognize. They'd brought their lawyer. I didn't rush to answer the door when they knocked. Let them wait in the cold for a few minutes. It might help them appreciate the warmth of being invited in, rather than assuming it was their right. When I finally opened the door, the tableau on my porch looked like a corporate delegation. Ethan and Madison flanked a thin man in an expensive overcoat, his briefcase clutched in one manicured hand. Behind them, Madison's parents stood like backup singers, their faces wearing expressions of practiced concern. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "This is Mr. Harrison, our attorney. We need to discuss your recent financial decisions." "No," I said pleasantly, "we don't." I started to close the door, but Harrison stepped forward. "Mr. Davidson, I represent your son and daughter-in-law in this matter. We have serious concerns about your mental state and your ability to make sound financial decisions." "Mr. Harrison," I replied, "I have serious concerns about your presumption that you have any right to discuss my private affairs. Good day." This time, I did close the door, turning the new deadbolt Tom and I had installed. The knocking resumed immediately, more insistent now, accompanied by voices that grew progressively louder. I called Harold from the kitchen phone, keeping my voice low. "They're here with their lawyer," I said, "making demands about my finances. Are they trying to enter the house?" "Not yet, just a lot of noise on the porch." "Document everything. Record the conversation if you can. And, Richard, don't let them provoke you into saying anything that could be taken out of context." I found my old cassette recorder in Margaret's desk drawer, the one she'd used for dictating her newsletter articles when she volunteered at the church. It still worked perfectly, the tape mechanism clicking quietly as I carried it to the front window. The voices outside were getting heated. I could hear Madison saying something about intervention and family responsibility. Gerald's deeper voice added complaints about wasted money and irresponsible behavior. But it was Harrison's words that caught my attention most clearly. "We have grounds for a conservatorship proceeding," he was saying. "The charitable donations show a pattern of impaired judgment, and his refusal to cooperate suggests possible paranoid behavior. I pressed the record button. What we need, Harrison continued, is evidence of clear deterioration. Medical records, documentation of unsafe living conditions, witness statements about erratic behavior. We have some of that, Madison said. The mold in his basement, the electrical problems, the way he's been isolating himself. Those are good, Harrison replied, but we need more. Recent incidents that show he's not capable of managing his affairs. I listened as they planned their strategy for proving I was incompetent, their voices carrying clearly through the front door. They discussed which neighbors to interview, which service providers might have noticed concerning behavior, and how to frame my charitable giving as evidence of mental decline rather than generous philanthropy. The conversation lasted another 10 minutes before they gave up and returned to their cars. I watched them through the window, their body language suggesting the kind of intense planning session that usually preceded a military campaign. After they left, I called Harold and played him the recording. "This is gold," he said when it finished. "They just admitted to manufacturing evidence and planning to suborn witnesses. Richard, they've handed us their entire playbook. What do we do with it? First, we make copies, multiple copies, then we prepare our counteroffensive. If they want to play games with the legal system, we'll show them what happens when they go up against someone who's actually prepared." That afternoon, I made 3 stops. First to Dr. Coleman's office, where I updated my cognitive assessment and documented my current excellent mental health. Then to Janet, the property inspector, who provided a detailed written report on the actual condition of my house. Excellent maintenance, no safety issues, certainly no mold or electrical problems. Finally to Carol at the bank, who prepared a comprehensive analysis of my financial decisions, showing that my charitable donations were not only reasonable, but reflected sound estate planning. "Your son and his wife are going to be very surprised," Carol said as she sealed the documents in an envelope. "These donations actually improved your financial position in several ways. Tax benefits, estate planning advantages, reduced probate complications. Far from being impaired judgment, this shows sophisticated financial planning." That evening, Tom stopped by with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "Heard you had visitors today," he said, settling into Margaret's reading chair. "Everything all right?" "Better than all right," I said, pouring us each 2 fingers. "They think they're hunting a wounded deer. They don't realize they're tracking a wolf." Tom raised his glass. "To wolves who know when to bare their teeth." We drank in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of quiet that exists between men who've both learned that most of life's important truths don't require words. Outside, the January wind rattled the windows, but inside the house felt warm and secure. "You know what the hardest part is?" I said eventually. "What's that?" "Realizing that the boy I raised, the one who used to help Margaret bake cookies and build snow forts in the backyard, that boy is gone. This man who shares his name is a stranger." Tom nodded slowly. "Happened to my brother's kid. Went to law school, married into money, started seeing his family as problems to be managed instead of people to be loved. Some people get educated beyond their wisdom. Margaret saw it coming. Her Christmas notebooks, she documented years of small changes, little signs that he was becoming someone else. I should have paid more attention. Wouldn't have changed anything. Some lessons people have to learn the hard way. Well, he's about to get a graduate course." The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Ethan's number on the caller ID, right on schedule. I let it go to voicemail, then played the message on speaker so Tom could hear. "Dad, this is ridiculous. We're family. We're trying to help you, and you're treating us like enemies. Call me back so we can work this out like adults." Like adults. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. I called Harold from the kitchen phone, while Tom listened to 3 more increasingly agitated voicemails. "They're escalating," I told him. "How soon can we move?" "Tomorrow morning. I've prepared a comprehensive response to any competency challenge they might file. Medical documentation, financial analysis, property inspection, witness statements from people who actually know you. Plus, the recorded conversation planning to manufacture evidence. And the other thing? The investigator's report, that's ready too. Very interesting reading. Turns out your son and daughter-in-law have some financial challenges of their own. Might explain their sudden interest in your estate." I smiled grimly. "How bad?" Bad enough that they're facing some difficult choices in the near future. Choices that would be much easier if they had access to your assets. When I hung up, Tom was studying me with the kind of expression he used to wear when sizing up a fire before deciding how to fight it. "You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you?" he said. "Since Christmas morning, when I realized what they'd really taken from me. It wasn't the decorations or the traditions. It was the assumption that they could manage my life better than I could. And now? Now they're going to learn that assumptions can be dangerous things." The next morning brought sunshine for the first time in a week. The kind of bright January light that made everything look sharp and clean. I dressed carefully, my best suit, the tie Margaret had bought me for our 40th anniversary. Shoes polished until they gleamed. When you're going to war, you dress like you expect to win. Harold's office was crowded with documents, evidence, and the kind of organized preparation that comes from 40 years of practicing law. Across from us sat a court reporter, her fingers poised over the stenography machine. "For the record," Harold began, "this is a voluntary deposition by Richard Davidson, given in response to allegations of mental incompetency filed by his son, Ethan Davidson, and daughter-in-law, Madison Davidson." For the next 3 hours, I answered questions about my mental state, my financial decisions, my living situation, and my reasons for making the charitable donations that had triggered their concerns. Every answer was supported by documentation, every claim backed by professional evaluation. When we finished, Harold smiled with the satisfaction of a man who'd just checkmate an opponent who hadn't realized they were playing chess. "Richard," he said, "if they proceed with this challenge, they're going to regret it. You're not just competent, you're demonstrably more prepared for your future than 90% of people your age." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Margaret's death. I invited a friend over for dinner. Tom arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and stories from his firefighting days that made me laugh harder than I had in months. As we cleaned up afterward, Tom paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where Margaret's garden lay dormant under a blanket of snow. "She'd be proud of you," he said quietly. "Think so?" "No, so. Takes real strength to stand up to family when they're wrong. Most people fold under that kind of pressure. I had a good teacher. Margaret never backed down from anything she believed in. Well, you learned the lesson." That night, I sat in Margaret's sewing room with her Christmas notebook spread across the desk, reading her observations about the family we'd built and the traditions we'd cherished. But this time, instead of grief, I felt something approaching peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh attempts to undermine my independence. But I was ready for all of it. Armed with documentation, supported by friends, protected by law, and motivated by the memory of a woman who taught me that love meant trusting people to make their own decisions. The war for my independence was almost over, and I was going to win it on my own terms, in my own time, in my own house. Just the way Margaret would have wanted it. The final confrontation came on a Thursday morning in late January, 3 weeks after Harold had filed our response to their competency challenge. I was reading the newspaper over breakfast when I heard the familiar sound of multiple vehicles in my driveway. But this time, when I looked out the window, I saw something that made me smile. Harold's Mercedes parked behind Ethan's BMW, and Tom Martinez's pickup truck, positioned strategically at the end of the driveway. The cavalry had arrived. I opened the door before anyone could knock, dressed in my best cardigan, the one Margaret had knitted for me during her last Christmas, and carrying a cup of coffee like I had all the time in the world. "Good morning," I said pleasantly to the assembled group on my porch. Ethan and Madison stood with their lawyer, Harrison, all three looking like they had aged considerably since our last meeting. Behind them, Harold waited with a briefcase and the kind of calm expression that comes from holding all the winning cards. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice strained, "we need to settle this." "I'm quite settled, thank you," I replied. "Harold, would you like to come in? Tom's already here, making another pot of coffee." I stepped aside to let Harold enter, then began to close the door. "Wait," Madison said, her polished composure finally cracking. "We need to talk about this competency challenge, about the money you've given away." "What about it?" Harrison cleared his throat importantly. "Mr. Davidson, my clients are prepared to withdraw their concerns about your mental state if we can reach an agreement about the estate planning decisions you've made." "An agreement," I repeated. "Such as?" reversing some of the charitable donations, restoring your will to its previous terms, acknowledging that perhaps you made these changes hastily, without full consideration of their impact on your family. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "No," I said finally. "Dad, be reasonable." Ethan started. "I am being reasonable," I interrupted. "Harold, would you mind sharing the findings from your investigation?" Harold opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Certainly. Mr. Davidson, your son and daughter-in-law's sudden concern about your finances makes much more sense when viewed in the context of their own financial situation." He handed me several papers, speaking loud enough for everyone on the porch to hear. Ethan Davidson, credit card debt totaling $67,000. Madison Davidson, personal loan default of $22,000. Joint mortgage payment arrears of 4 months. And, most interesting, a second mortgage taken out on their home 6 months ago to cover previous debts. I watched the blood drain from Madison's face. Ethan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "They're not concerned about your mental state," Harold continued. "They're concerned about their own financial survival. The timing of their competency challenge corresponds exactly with the date their mortgage company initiated foreclosure proceedings." "That's not," Madison began. "It's all documented," Harold said, pulling out more papers. "Bank records, court filings, credit reports. Your son and his wife aren't trying to protect you from poor decisions. They're trying to protect themselves from the consequences of their own poor decisions." The silence that followed was profound. Even Harrison looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing he'd been hired to pursue a case built on false pretenses. "Furthermore," Harold continued, "their attempt to have you declared incompetent backfired spectacularly. The court-ordered psychological evaluation, which they requested, concluded that you possess exceptional mental acuity for someone your age. The financial analysis they demanded showed that your charitable donations were not only reasonable, but demonstrated sophisticated estate planning, and the investigation into your living situation found your home to be excellently maintained and perfectly safe." I turned to Ethan, feeling something I hadn't expected: pity. "You could have just asked for help," I said quietly. "If you were in financial trouble, you could have come to me honestly, explained the situation, asked for assistance. I might have said yes. Dad, instead, you chose to lie about my mental state, manufacture evidence of my decline, and try to have me declared incompetent so you could control my assets. You treated me like an obstacle instead of your father." Ethan's shoulders sagged. For a moment, he looked like the lost little boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. We just didn't know what else to do." "You could have tried honesty," I said. "You could have tried treating me like family instead of a problem to be solved." Madison stepped forward, her voice shaking. "What about Christmas? What about the decorations we took?" I smiled, thinking of the new ornaments and lights stored in my garage, waiting for next December. "Keep them," I said. "Consider them a gift, but understand that taking them was the last Christmas tradition we'll ever share. Dad, please." "The competency challenge is dismissed," Harold announced. "Your legal costs for that frivolous action will be substantial. The charitable donations stand as executed, and your father's revised will remain in effect." Harrison mumbled something about withdrawing their petition and hurried away to his car, clearly eager to distance himself from a case that had collapsed so completely. Madison's parents followed, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Ethan lingered on the porch, looking at me with eyes that held a mixture of desperation and something that might have been respect. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you learn to live with the consequences of your choices," I said, "just like everyone else." Could you ever forgive us?" I considered the question seriously. "I don't know. Maybe someday. But trust? Trust takes time to rebuild, and you'll have to earn it." After they left, I sat in my living room with Harold and Tom, feeling lighter than I had in months. "It's over," Harold said, packing up his papers. "They can't challenge your competency again without new evidence, and they have no legal standing to contest your financial decisions." "What about their house?" Tom asked. "That's their problem to solve," I said. "I offered to help once, through love and generosity. I won't be manipulated into helping through guilt and deception." That evening, I walked through my house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. In the living room, the corner where our Christmas tree had stood for 34 years looked ready for something new. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the cookies Margaret used to bake, but now it also carried the scent of fresh coffee and the promise of meals shared with real friends. In Margaret's sewing room, I opened her final Christmas notebook and read her last entry again. Told Richard if something happens to me, he shouldn't let anyone turn Christmas into something it's not. It's about love, not display, about family, not performance. He promised he'd remember that. Hope he does. I picked up a pen and wrote beneath her words, "Promise kept. Next Christmas will be about love again. About chosen family, not obligated family. About joy, not manipulation. Margaret would approve." Spring came early that year, melting the snow in February and coaxing green shoots from Margaret's garden before March arrived. I hired a landscaping service to help restore the flower beds, not because I couldn't do the work myself, but because I wanted to share the project with people who appreciated the beauty Margaret had created. Tom became a regular dinner companion, bringing his stories and his laughter to a kitchen that had been too quiet for too long. Harold and his wife invited me to their annual barbecue, introducing me to other clients who'd become friends, other widowers who'd learned to build new lives from the ashes of old ones. The letters from various charities began arriving in April, thank you notes from scholarship recipients, progress reports from the Veterans Housing Program, photos of animals thriving in the upgraded shelter facilities. Each letter reminded me that Margaret's values lived on in tangible ways, that our money was helping people build better lives, rather than simply enabling more consumption. Ethan called once in late spring, his voice subdued and careful. "Dad, I wanted you to know we're filing for bankruptcy. The house is going into foreclosure." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "I know you probably think we deserve it. I think you made choices, and now you're facing consequences. That's how life works for everyone. Would you consider helping? Just enough to keep the house?" I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about second chances and tough love, and the difference between helping someone and enabling them. "No," I said finally, "but I'll help you find a good bankruptcy attorney. And when you're ready to rebuild your lives honestly, we can talk about what real family support looks like." November arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything look sharp-edged and full of possibility. I spent a weekend in the garage, unpacking the new Christmas decorations I'd bought the previous January. Each ornament was a small declaration of independence, a reminder that traditions could be renewed rather than simply repeated. Tom helped me string lights around the outside of the house, both of us moving carefully on ladders that creaked under our weight, but held steady. When we finished, the house glowed with warm light that could be seen from the road, welcoming anyone who chose to visit, but requiring no invitation from those who took it for granted. On Christmas Eve, my house filled with chosen family. Tom brought his daughter and her children, who'd driven down from Minneapolis. Harold and his wife came with homemade cookies and stories from their grandchildren. The neighbors I'd been getting to know throughout the year stopped by with dishes to share and voices raised in carols that filled the rooms with joy. We ate dinner at the table where Margaret and I had shared thousands of meals. But instead of feeling like a shrine to the past, it felt like a celebration of the present. The children played with toys I'd bought specifically for the occasion, their laughter echoing through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. As the evening wound down and my guests prepared to leave, Tom's granddaughter, a serious 8-year-old named Sophie, approached me with something clutched in her small hands. "Mr. Davidson," she said solemnly, "I made this for you." She handed me a paper angel, carefully colored and decorated with glitter that sparkled in the Christmas tree lights. On the back, in careful crayon letters, she'd written, "For new friends at Christmas." I hung it on the tree immediately, right next to Margaret's favorite spot, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced since she died. Contentment. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house had returned to its peaceful quiet, I sat in my chair looking at the tree we decorated together. Not Margaret and me, but my chosen family and me. The lights twinkled softly, casting dancing shadows on walls that held 40 years of memories, but were ready for 40 more. I raised a glass of bourbon to Margaret's photograph on the mantel. "Merry Christmas, my love," I said aloud. "You were right about everything. Family isn't just blood. It's choice. And love isn't just sentiment, it's action. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the world in the promise of new beginnings. Inside, my house felt warm and full of possibility, decorated with traditions both old and new, filled with the echoes of laughter from people who'd chosen to be here rather than felt obligated to attend. For the first time since Margaret's death, Christmas felt like Christmas again, not a performance or a display, but a celebration of love freely given and gratefully received. I had reclaimed more than my independence. I had reclaimed my joy, and that I knew was exactly what Margaret would have wanted for me. Not just survival, but a life worth living, surrounded by people who saw me as a person to be cherished rather than a problem to be managed. The war was over. The holidays were mine again. And the future, for the first time in years, looked bright with possibility. The year that followed taught me things about resilience I'd never expected to learn at my age. Spring brought more than just Margaret's flowers blooming in the garden. It brought a steady stream of visitors who had heard about the scholarship program and wanted to share their stories. Sarah Martinez was the first scholarship recipient to knock on my door. A 34-year-old single mother who'd been laid off from the factory where she'd worked for 12 years, she was using the Margaret Davidson Adult Learner Scholarship to study nursing. She stood on my porch in April with tears in her eyes and a handwritten thank you note that made my throat tight. "Mrs. Davidson's scholarship is changing my life," she said. "I wanted you to know that every dollar is going towards something meaningful. My kids will see their mother graduate from college. That's a gift I never thought I could give them." I invited her in for coffee, and she told me about her studies, her dreams of working in pediatric care, her determination to build a better life for her family. As she spoke, I could almost hear Margaret's voice saying, "This is exactly what we hoped for." More visits followed throughout the spring and summer, veterans using their housing assistance to get back on their feet, families whose children were being fed through the food bank programs. Each story was a reminder that money spent on others multiplied in ways that simple accumulation never could. Tom and I developed a routine of Thursday evening dinners, alternating between his house and mine. He was teaching me to play chess, a game Margaret had never cared for, and I was sharing Margaret's recipe collection with him. His attempts at her famous apple pie were enthusiastic if not entirely successful. But the laughter that filled my kitchen during these cooking experiments was worth more than perfect pastry. "You know what I realized?" he said one evening as we surveyed his latest culinary disaster. "Being widowed doesn't mean you stop living. It means you learn to live differently." "Margaret would have liked you," I said, scraping burnt pie filling into the garbage disposal. "She had patience for people who tried hard, even when they failed spectacularly. Well, she raised a good man. That's something to be proud of." The comment stayed with me long after Tom went home. Margaret had raised a good man, or at least she'd helped shape one, but she hadn't raised Ethan alone, and his choices as an adult were his own responsibility. I was learning to separate my love for the boy he'd been from my disappointment in the man he'd become. Summer brought an unexpected phone call. Jessica from the college development office called to tell me that the scholarship program had generated so much interest that they wanted to establish an annual lecture series in Margaret's name. "We'd like to have speakers address topics she cared about," Jessica explained. "Adult education, community service, the importance of lifelong learning. Would you consider being our first speaker?" The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. I'd never been comfortable with public speaking, but the thought of sharing Margaret's philosophy with a wider audience felt like the right kind of tribute. I spent weeks preparing my remarks, reading through her notebooks and volunteer records, trying to distill 47 years of marriage into 20 minutes of meaningful reflection. The night before the lecture, I sat in her sewing room practicing my speech aloud, imagining her gentle corrections and encouraging nods. The auditorium was fuller than I'd expected. Students, faculty, community members, scholarship recipients, and volunteers from the organizations Margaret had supported. As I walked to the podium, I felt her presence so strongly that I almost turned to look for her in the audience. "My wife Margaret believed that education was the great equalizer," I began, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "Not just formal education, but the lifelong learning that comes from staying curious about the world and compassionate toward the people in it." I spoke about her tutoring work, her belief that everyone deserved a second chance, her conviction that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. I talked about the Christmas notebooks, her careful attention to the details that made life meaningful, her understanding that traditions were worth preserving only if they continued to serve love rather than obligation. The applause when I finished was warm and sustained, but what moved me most were the conversations afterward. Students who thanked me for reminding them why they were in school, community members who shared their own stories of second chances and new beginnings, faculty who spoke about Margaret's influence on their own teaching philosophy. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, the sense that I was still contributing something meaningful to the world, not just preserving her memory, but extending her influence into the future. Fall arrived with its usual cascade of color, the maple trees in my yard turning shades of gold and crimson that made the house look like it was framed in sunset. I spent October preparing for my second Christmas as an independent man, planning a celebration that would honor both tradition and renewal. The phone call came on a gray November afternoon. Ethan's voice was subdued, careful, carrying none of the entitled confidence I'd grown to dread. "Dad, I wanted to let you know that Madison and I are getting divorced." I set down the book I'd been reading, one of Margaret's mysteries, and gave him my full attention. "I'm sorry to hear that. The bankruptcy, losing the house, all the stress, it broke something between us. We couldn't get past what we'd done to you, how we treated you. It poisoned everything else." I was quiet for a moment, searching for words that were honest without being cruel. "That's a hard thing to face," I said finally. "I've been going to counseling, trying to understand how I became someone who could treat his own father that way. The therapist says I got confused about success and security, started seeing family as assets instead of people. That's a start. I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Not sorry because I got caught, not sorry because it didn't work out the way I planned. Sorry because I betrayed everything you and Mom taught me about love and respect and family." His voice broke on the last words, and for a moment I heard the boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on bugs in the garden. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a relationship. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I lost, and it wasn't your money. It was your respect, your trust, your love." "Ethan," I said gently, "you didn't lose my love. You disappointed it. You complicated it. You made it harder to express, but you didn't lose it." The silence that followed was different from the angry silences of our previous conversations. This one held possibility. "I'm moving back to town," he said finally. "Got a job at the community college, teaching business classes. It's a pay cut from what I was making, but it's honest work, helping people instead of just chasing money. That sounds like a good choice. Maybe someday when I've proven that I've changed, we could have coffee. Talk about something other than money and property and all the ways I screwed up." "Maybe," I said. "When you're ready, when I'm ready, when we both trust that the conversation is about rebuilding instead of revisiting." After we hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness thinking about second chances and the long road between recognition and redemption. Ethan's apology felt genuine, but apologies were just words until they were backed up by consistent action over time. December arrived with the kind of sharp cold that made everything crystalline and bright. I spent the first week decorating the house, not alone this time, but with help from my chosen family. Tom brought his ladder and his steady hands. Harold and his wife contributed their collection of vintage ornaments. The neighbors I'd grown close to throughout the year stopped by with cookies and carols and the kind of casual assistance that comes from genuine friendship. The tree we decorated together was fuller than any I'd had since Margaret's death, heavy with ornaments that told stories both old and new. Sophie's paper angel from the previous year held a place of honor near the top, joined now by other handmade contributions from the children who'd become part of my extended family. On Christmas Eve, my house filled again with people who'd chosen to be there, the scholarship recipients who'd become friends, bringing updates on their studies and their dreams. Tom's extended family, now including me, as an honorary grandfather to children who called me Mr. D, and sought me out for stories about the old days. Neighbors who'd discovered that community was something you built rather than something that simply happened. We ate dinner at the long table I'd expanded with extra leaves to accommodate everyone who belonged there. The conversation flowed in multiple directions, English and Spanish, and the universal language of laughter. Children played between the adults' chairs, their presence filling the house with energy that had been missing for too long. As the evening wound down, Tom's daughter Lisa, the one who'd driven down from Minneapolis the year before, pulled me aside. "Mr. Davidson, I wanted to thank you for becoming part of our family. Dad's been so much happier since you two became friends. He needed someone who understood what it's like to lose a partner and find a way to keep living. He's been good for me too," I said. "Your father taught me that friendship doesn't end when you get old. It just gets more valuable. Well, you're stuck with us now. Fair warning." That night, after everyone had gone home and the house had settled into its peaceful quiet, I walked through the rooms slowly, seeing them not as spaces to be maintained, but as places where life continued to unfold. The kitchen where new friends learned old recipes. The living room where children played and adults planned futures full of possibility. The guest room that actually hosted guests now, people who chose to visit rather than felt obligated to check on me. I stopped in Margaret's sewing room, now lined with thank you letters from scholarship recipients and photographs from community events I'd attended throughout the year. Her presence was still there, but it felt less like a shrine and more like a foundation, the solid base from which new growth could spring. On Christmas morning, I woke early and made coffee in the quiet kitchen, watching the sun rise over a yard that showed the footprints of all the visitors who'd shared my holidays. The snow was unmarked except for the tracks of the rabbits and deer, who discovered that my property was a safe place to rest. The doorbell rang at 9 o'clock. I opened it to find a young woman I didn't recognize, holding a small wrapped package. "Mr. Davidson, I'm Amy Chen. I received the Margaret Davidson Scholarship last year to study education. I graduate this spring." I invited her in, and she told me her story over coffee and the Christmas morning quiet. A refugee family, parents who'd worked 3 jobs each to keep food on the table, a daughter who dreamed of becoming a teacher but couldn't afford college until she'd found our scholarship program. "I wanted to bring you this," she said, handing me the package. "It's not much, but I thought Mrs. Davidson would have liked it." Inside was a small ceramic ornament, hand-painted with a scene of children reading under a tree. On the back, in careful lettering, was inscribed, "For Margaret, whose love of learning lives on." I hung it on the tree immediately, right next to Sophie's paper angel and a dozen other ornaments that had been gifts from people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's continuing influence. The phone rang as Amy was leaving. I almost didn't answer. Christmas morning calls were rarely good news, but something made me pick up. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was tentative, hopeful. "I know you're probably busy, but I wanted to wish you Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Ethan." "I'm volunteering at the homeless shelter today, serving Christmas dinner. It's something I should have been doing years ago instead of just thinking about what I could get." "That's good," I said. "Service changes your perspective." "Dad, I know this is asking a lot, but would you consider having coffee with me sometime? Not to ask for anything, not to rehash the past, just to talk. Maybe start figuring out how to be father and son again." I looked around my living room, at the tree heavy with gifts given and received in love, at the photographs of Margaret that no longer made me sad, but instead reminded me of the happiness we'd shared, at the evidence everywhere that life could be rebuilt and joy could be reclaimed. "Yes," I said, "I'd like that." After we hung up, I sat in my chair with my coffee and my memories and my hopes for the future. The morning light streamed through windows that Margaret had chosen, illuminating a home that had been ours together and was now fully mine, filled with people who'd chosen to be part of my story rather than felt obligated to manage it. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something you granted all at once. It was something you built slowly, carefully, with no guarantee of success, but with the understanding that some things were worth the risk of trying again. The war for my independence was long over. The battle for my dignity had been won completely. What remained was the quieter work of building a life that honored both the past I'd shared with Margaret and the future I was creating without her physical presence, but with her values as my guide. Christmas music played softly from the radio in the kitchen. Snow fell outside the windows, and somewhere in the house that had sheltered 40 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood and now 1 year of renewal, I felt Margaret's approval settling around me like a warm blanket. I had kept my promise to her. Christmas was about love again, not display. About family again, not performance. About joy chosen rather than obligation endured. And for the first time since her death, I looked forward to all the Christmases still to come.